that light still exists in the world. Right? So the world kind of emerges out of the emptiness created by God's contraction. And the Dalai Lama listens intently and nods his head and says, that is a powerful Jewish story. He says, again, will you be a good Jew? He looks at me and he's like, you are a Muslim. And I was like, I was about to tell you about my Zazen practice. Get some tips from you. He repeats again, you are a Muslim. And then he tells this story to Kevin and I about the relationship between Tibetan Buddhists and Muslims for centuries, which begins with the Dalai Lama. So it's a couple of centuries ago when, the Dalai Lama was still in Lhasa in Tibet, in the Patel in his palace. He looked out one day and he saw a man on a mountain do a set of prostrations. And he said to his people, I've never seen that before, bring that man to me. So this man comes to the court of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama says, what are you doing? The man says, I'm doing Muslim prayer. So I said, what's a Muslim? What is this Muslim prayer thing? And this man says, well, we have come through Tibet for many years now. We're traders. And a small group, community of my fellow Muslim traders have settled here. And we don't have a mosque. And so I find the highest point that I can, which is this mountain, and I offer my prayers. And the Dalai Lama says, well, tell me about Islam. And so this man talks about the idea of one God, the idea of mercy, the idea of compassion. And the Dalai Lama, again, this Dalai Lama, is telling Kevin and I the story in our brief meeting. Says, we disagree on this theological dimension. We don't have God in the way you have God. But this notion of compassion, of mercy, we have that. And I want to welcome you into my community if that is what you're bringing. And so the Dalai Lama sends his archers to the top of this mountain. His archers send one arrow in each of the four directions. And that becomes the borders of the Muslim community in Tibet several centuries ago. So the Dalai Lama finishes the story and says, mercy, compassion, Islam, be a good Muslim. So now I'm totally confused. But Ken and I go back to Bombay where we're staying with my grandmother, and something happens which clarifies a lot of things for me. I wake up one day in my grandmother's apartment in Bombay, and there's a woman there who doesn't seem like a family member, doesn't seem like part of the household help. She looks a little bit nervous, a little bit scared. She's wearing a torn white nightgown, several sizes too big for her. And I say to my grandmother, who is she? And my grandmother says, I don't know her real name. We will call her Anisa. The leader of the local Muslim prayer hall brought her here. Her father and her uncle abuse her, so we'll take care of her. 22 years old. I know a thing or two about the world. I begin to scold my grandmother. Like, Mom, don't you think it's a little bit crazy to shelter refugees from their abusers? What if these people come to the door and seek her? Then we'll all be in danger. My grandmother looks at me, arched eyebrows in a grandmotherly type way, and says, crazy, huh? How old are you? I said, I'm 22. She said, I've been doing this more than twice the amount of time you've been alive. She padded over to the cupboard and she brought out the shoebox. She opened it up, and in that shoebox were all these Polaroid pictures of women over the past half century that my grandmother had taken into her apartment. And she had written their stories in the back, and a couple of pencil scratchings on the back of these postcards. And she said, this woman came from Gujarat, and her husband died. She was working in the fields for barely anything, and 3 children, came here during the monsoon because she had heard that my home was a sanctuary. She showed up at the door, dripping wet. We took her in, the 3 children, we put into school. We made sure that she learned a craft. She's a beautician. She now lives in Hyderabad with a new husband. She had dozens of these stories. And towards the end, I said, why do you do this? And my grandmother looked at me as if I had ignored the obvious. She was like, I'm a Muslim. This is what Muslims do. And I was astounded. Right? Because if there was one tradition I hadn't looked at in my faith and social justice journey, It was Islam. It was the tradition of my ancestors. It was the religion I was raised in. It was the mantras that were just in my house. It was the Arabic carving on the walls of my home. It was too familiar to study, too much a part of me to seem interesting to read books on. But my family had a Dorothy Day in it. Right? My extended world included a Muslim worker house. And I went to bed that night. I thought about the line from the work of T.S. Eliot. We do not inherit traditions. We work to make ourselves worthy of them. And I realized that I was on the cusp of something very new. I was on the cusp of calling myself a Muslim. That, there's a beautiful line in the work of the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. The roar of creation resolves into music. Well, the roar of my journey of the past several years of confusion, of exploration, of study, of quest, I knew at that moment had resolved into a commitment called Islam. But I had just heard what the Dalai Lama had said about Islam. And I had just watched how my grandmother practiced Islam. And I wasn't quite ready to call myself a Muslim without making myself worthy of what that meant. And I think worthy asks one question of you. What are you doing? How are you making this real? What are you putting into practice? One of the first things that I did was I went back to the texts of Islam. And I asked myself the question, what is it in these texts that I seek to make real in this world? And the part of the Muslim text of the Holy Quran that spoke to me most powerfully and most clearly in those beginning days of my journey was the creation story from Surah 2 of the Holy Quran. And the story goes like this, that God creates Adam with a lump of clay and his breath, gives a piece of the earth the power of his breath, and there's the first human being, the representative of all humankind. And God says to Adam, I've created you to be my Abd and Khalifa, my servant and representative on the earth. The oceans and the forests and the animals, you are its steward. You have to take care of it. You are my caretaker on the planet. And God calls forth the angels and says to the angels, I want you to honor my creation, humankind, who I have made the caretaker of the earth. And the angels laugh. And they say, why would we honor a creature who will only fiddle and destroy? And God says, I know what you do not know. So I put the book down at that point. Because I figured that was worth like several hours of reflection and simulation. And what is God telling us in this text? Basically, that when the angels saw our lower self, our jinns, our nafs, they saw the worst of humankind, God punished for us and said, I know what you do not know. So what does it mean to be our higher selves? What Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. What did God see in us at that moment where he vouched for us, where he argued with his angels? What does it mean to manifest that? And there's a clue, I think, in the second part of that story. God sets up a contest between Adam and the angels. The contest to name the different parts of creation.